We have a great analysis here from the Kiev Post, the beginning of the end of Putin in Crimea, made by Mark Toth and Jonathan Sweet. Months in the making, Ukraine is again boldly taking the fight to Russian President Vladimir Putin. Inside of Russia itself, in and around Bakhmut, and now, most notably, strategically southward in the Zaporizhia Oblast toward the decisive terrain of the Crimean Peninsula. We have called for strategic patience in these pages and elsewhere, cautioning that we would know when Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and his generals' counteroffensive would take shape. We are now starting to see it develop in small villages and towns such as Robotyne and Verbov. It was never going to be easy, especially since the Kremlin had months to prepare its defensive lines in Zaporizhia because of the Biden administration's dithering in getting Kiev the full suite of ammunition and weapons that would best position Ukraine's armed forces to achieve an outright victory over Putin. Wars are managed in a variety of ways, leveraging the instruments of national power collectively known by the acronym DIME: diplomacy, information, military, and economic. Up until now, given relative static battlefronts, the war in Ukraine has been predominantly one of military forces engaged in close combat, the results of which have played out in the information ecosphere with it being weaponized, creating a nebula of war and competing narratives. Washington urging Zelensky to press his counteroffensive. Ukraine's defense ministry is pushing back on social media, insisting they know best. Ukraine has weighted the DIME equation back to military, and in doing so is foreshadowing the beginning of the end of Putin in Crimea. Ukraine's hard-fought counterattack south of Robotyne in the Russian-occupied Zaporizhia Oblast is progressing south. Zelensky and his generals are encouraged by what they are seeing. The fog or nebula of war is lifting, and Ukraine is on the move, while the Kremlin now finds itself in reaction mode and facing the reality that maneuver warfare favors Ukraine. Retaking Zaporizhia is key in isolating the Crimean Peninsula from Russia. If and when the coastal land route is severed by Ukraine, Moscow would be reduced to reinforcing its military forces in Crimea via Black Sea shipping or across the Kerch Bridge. Once that happens, Kiev would likely destroy the bridge using air-launched cruise missiles, Storm Shadow, Scalp, or Germany's Taurus missile. Ukraine's innovative Sea Baby naval drones would be highly disruptive to Russian sea shipping and sustainment operations. To achieve this game-changing, if not game-ending result, Zelensky needs his counteroffensive forces to continue breaking through the layers of multiple Russian defensive belts, which are heavily seeded with mines, trenches, dragon's teeth obstacles, and dismounted infantry guarding Zaporizhia. It has not been easy. However, Ukraine is doing just that. Elements of Kiev's troops have liberated Robotyne, while others are pushing southeast toward the small city of Verbove and creating an expanding bulge southward. Each of these are significant, as they are indicative of Ukraine having fully breached what is described as the main defensive belt, and are now being afforded maneuver west and south, while also being able to concentrate HIMARS and other artillery fires, including cluster munitions on Russia's layered defensive belts. The significance of this movement southward is not lost on Washington nor Moscow. After weeks of growing U.S. criticism concerning the pace of Ukraine's counteroffensive, indeed, even its direction, General Mark Milley, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, acknowledged steady Ukrainian progress. Russia, in response, has been forced to reposition and expose their remaining best forces in Ukraine in order to block the advance, potentially leaving gaps in their defenses. After Ukraine's decisive breakthrough at Robotyne, the Kremlin dispatched elements of the once-elite 76th Guards Air Assault Division, VDW, to attempt to shore up its defenses in the area facing Kiev's onslaught. Likewise, to relieve pressure in Zaporizhia, Russia again, either as an actual counterattack or demonstration to fix Ukrainian forces, is reported to have amassed 100,000 troops along the Kupiansk-Lyman axis in northeast Ukraine. Zelensky has forced Putin's commanding general, Valery Gerasimov, to divide his forces away from Crimea's decisive terrain, which will likely determine the outcome of the war. Zelensky's National Guard and Territorial Defense Forces will continue to attrit Russian ground forces in the Donbas, as they did all winter and spring, as his best-trained and equipped forces continue to press south toward the Crimean Peninsula. Predictably, Moscow cannot figure out how to publicly react to Kiev's breakthrough, let alone get on the same page. Even as late as last Wednesday, Telegram channels were touting reports from Russian soldiers falsely claiming they still occupied Robotyne. Recent drone attacks on Moscow and elsewhere in Russia, including the Pskov airport, further contribute to the noise and counter the narrative given Russian citizens can now see and feel firsthand the Kremlin's inability to defend their cities. Moscow is on the verge of panic. Putin propagandist and former Russian General Andrei Gurulev, appearing on Vladimir Solovyov's streaming show, urged Putin to use a tactical nuke on Ukrainian forces in and around Robotyne, noting, "Perfect. They are all bunched up there. Simply perfect." Yet another Russian man-boy crying nuclear wolf, albeit it was music to Solovyov's ears, who readily agreed. Ukraine remains undeterred. Putin's use of nuclear pacifiers by his propagandists may work for a badly misinformed Russian public, however, not on Kyiv or Washington and Brussels. As Putin's red line increasingly comes under assault, his only recourse remains targeting civilians and Ukrainian grain. Meanwhile, Ukraine keeps pressing south. Seizing Verbov and moving on to Tokmak is likely Ukraine's next move, notwithstanding the Kremlin's efforts to forestall Kiev's growing momentum. Taking Tokmak is vital, as it would provide Ukraine with a glide path to the major city of Melitopol and its control of Russia's land bridge between Crimea and the increasingly war-beleaguered motherland. It would also put Ukrainian artillery in striking distance of Melitopol itself and the ability to disrupt Russian lines of communication. Notably, Ukraine is also hitting its stride. Despite the enormous cost in lives estimated at 70,000 dead and up to 120,000 wounded, not counting civilian casualties, Zelensky and his generals are taking the fight to Russia. Drone strikes on Moscow, swarm drone attacks on Russian air bases, including Wednesday's attack on the Pskov airport inside of Russia that destroyed multiple military transport planes. And Ukraine is manufacturing its own drones and surface vessels to continue launching a steady stream of cross-border attacks. Crimea is the end state. To achieve that, Zelensky and his generals must either isolate the peninsula, force a surrender, or reconquer it. Ukraine is doing just that, not only in terms of the close fight in Robotyne and Verbov, but in their multi-domain operations as well. As General Ben Hodges, former commanding general of U.S. Army Europe, recently stated, the Ukrainian counteroffensive is more than the ground assault. Ukrainians have the initiative and are gradually making Crimea untenable for Russian Navy, Air Force, air defense. The war is by no means close to being over. Hard days lie ahead. But we are seeing the beginning of the end of Putin in Crimea and eventually all of Ukraine. Even the Biden administration has taken notice. As a senior State Department official told reporters on Wednesday, it's very important that Ukraine win this war. And by win, I mean, as President Biden said, Russians leave all of Ukraine.